Here we have some very famous hands holding a model of a very famous car. Those hands belong to none other than Luigi Chinetti Sr., who was responsible for Ferrari's first Le Mans victory in 1949, and that's a model of the car that he drove in 49. In fact, he drove almost the entire 24 hours by himself. His partner, Lord Seltzen, was not able to drive more than perhaps about half an hour. Anyway, so Chinetti won this race, and that's my prototype model. It happens to also be my first CMA Models large-scale edition. The photo was taken by Jesse Alexander in 1992 in front of Mr. Chinetti's home, where we did photo shoot. There were some more photos too, which we'll show in just a moment. And one more image here, that is myself, a much younger me, standing next to Mr. Chinetti, and we're holding, again, my prototype model, the Barchetta. This was taken during a photo shoot outside of his house in Connecticut, which I live not too far from. And the photo, this one and the previous photo, were taken by none other than Jesse Alexander, who many of you may recognize as being a world-famous motor racing photographer. So this was a special shoot that Jesse wanted to do, and we worked it out. And here we have Mr. Chinetti sitting in his den at his house in Connecticut, once again holding the prototype model, my 166 Barchetta, which was model of his winning car at Le Mans in 1949. That picture in his den was amazing. He was surrounded by so many artifacts from his racing career and his time with Ferrari, and being responsible for Ferrari in North America. Not to mention, without him, Ferrari would not exist today. He was really a driving force behind the scenes, an amazing personality. This is my 1/14th scale Ferrari 166 Barchetta, model of chassis number 0008M, which was a racing Barchetta, and as mentioned before, it was Luigi Chinetti's winning car in Le Mans in 1949. One of the first large-scale models ever done of this car, and it's also the most accurate, even though it's not necessarily as historically accurate as I make things today, but it is pretty damn close, and more so than a lot of other people have done over time. So here we're showing it pretty much all opened up. Now the model has full chassis detail too, and we'll show chassis in a moment. I'm just going to spin it around a little bit so you can see some of the other views of this model. And the one that I'm showing here is one that's my sample piece for my collection, and gives an idea of the overall. This was the final iteration of these. We did try to make and add more detail to them as we went along. And this is one of approximately 75 that I built. The production run was going to be 250, but for various reasons I cut the run very short and decided that was it. Some of these models were also given out as awards at well-known vintage races. Now I'm just going to pick it up a little bit just so you can see a little more of the engine detail that we have in there with the wiring and hoses and such. Now I would go even further today doing a model with engine detail, but this is really quite something. And considering when we did this model's almost 30 years old. These were made in 1991, was when we first started production. And model production has come pretty far since then, leaps and bounds. And the interior is quite detailed, and we'll go over that in just a moment. I'm just going to try to tilt up the trunk a little bit, trunk area a little bit, so you can see underneath. We even had wiring to the lights, aside from all the other correct components in there, the correct gas tank, wire wheels. Wire wheels were made to my specs. They were hand-laced wire wheels made in Italy, specifically for these models. Now as we go to the interior, which is quite detailed, in fact we had a wood rim steering wheel finally on these. The dashboard gauges are actually three-dimensional gauges, which you'd have to look really closely in person to see. And you'll notice different things like there's this unusual tank that's in front of the seats. That goes into how I started to do my research and how I go much further today. Discovered that tank when looking at photos going through the Clementoschi archives, where he had photographed at the time during the race. And in fact, I'm just going to pull over quickly one of the research photos that I pulled out, which was in there, and you will see there's the tank. And it was only in this car this one time for this one race, never in any other car, never in this car again. And I asked Mr. Kennedy about it, and he was the one that told us that it was a reserve oil tank and how he used it during the race and why he used it, which is a whole other story. But even the fellow that owned the Clementowski archives back then, Peter Sachs, who's well known in Ferrari circles, neither of us knew what it was. So it was with my going further and talking to Mr. Kennedy about it. Now we're going to show the other two models in just a moment that came off of this series as well. Originally I was going to do just the Le Mans car, but things just spiraled and somewhat out of control, as they tend to do, and projects take on a life of their own, which is what happened with this one. So we did the Le Mans winner, and then there were two other cars I did, which we'll show in just a moment. This is a Ferrari 166mm Barchetta. It's modeled based on chassis number 0058M. Now, I didn't do it quite. This particular car, I decided I wanted for myself in yellow. There have been some Barchettas that were painted yellow with a black interior, so that's the way we went. But the original car, the exact car, was actually a dark red with a brown interior. We did a number of those too. In fact, I didn't do a lot of the Lusso model, and it's called Lusso, which was luxury and for road. You'll notice that it has more leather trim, and it has the stitching around the doors, leather panels. The seats are different, the chassis is different, the dashboard is different. Even the size and shape of the hood. This has a long hood as opposed to on the Le Mans car. So this is, and the engine was different too. Different layout. We had front-mounted distributors versus rear-mounted magnetos on the Le Mans car. Many differences. Chrome wire wheels. Front was different too, with little horn grills that were on the car. The shapes of the bezels, which you can't really tell, but the shapes of the bezels for the headlights, those are even a bit different than they are on the Le Mans car. A lot of differences on all these cars. In fact, every single Barchetta was slightly different, but there are differences in the early cars versus the late cars in terms of body styles, shapes of openings. The trunk also was a larger and different shaped opening as well. This also had full chassis detail, and although I planned originally to do another 250 or 200 or so of these, we only built about maybe 20 or so of the Lusso Barchettas altogether. Again, part of it was just the difficulty with doing the project and just how things went, so I decided to cut it short at that time. But 0058M also, which this is a similar model to, but 0058, that was also Eugenio Castellotti's first racing car. And at the time when we modeled the car, it belonged to Ed Gilbertson, and the car was widely known throughout the world as being the most original of all the Barchettas in existence. Subsequently sold to another client of mine, Lorenzo Zambrano, who has since passed away. He unfortunately took the car apart and had it fully restored, so now it's like too many other old Ferraris that have been ruined by over-the-top restorations. Anyway, so we're finished with showing this one. It gives you, the idea. I could talk for hours about these and as to what the details are, but you get an idea with that. And we've got one more car to show after this one. All right, and last up here, this is the third Barchetta I decided to do while doing the production run. And this it was owned by a very significant personality in Ferrari circles. A couple of names that I'll mention. This happened to be Giovanni Agnelli's first ever Ferrari. In later years, it was purchased and owned by Jacques Swatters, who was the Ferrari distributor pretty much for the Benelux countries. I mean, again, significant. And Swatters owned Garage Francochamps and was heavily involved in racing for years. Anyway, wonderful car, and that is in its very unusual original paint scheme, which is a two-tone metallic blue over a metallic green with chrome wheels, with a tan interior. Again, it's a Lusso version, so more luxurious, so it has the carpeting and the stitching around the outside of the cockpit. This, again, differs from the other two Barchettas in many details, though it is a later car, so this chassis number of this is 0064M. And Jacques Swatters was kind enough to do a deal with me where he autographed all the plaques for the edition that we were doing, as did Kennedy with his edition. But the Swatters car we were originally going to do a very short run, do only 50 of, and actually I did even less. I think we made approximately 30 of these cars. Again, everything opens up on it. It's quite detailed. Differences abound. Different types of trunk latches, different details. Inside we simulated there's got the little leather toolkit in there. The gas tank is a different shape, so the spare tire goes differently. There is a support rod for this, but it's a little difficult to get up there. And you'll notice too it has these teardrop shaped taillights in addition to the round taillights. And again, that was how the car was. The dashboard, very nice. Again, it differs from the other two cars. And this was a slightly earlier piece in my production series before we went to 3D gauges. So it has the printed gauges with flat photo etch bezels as opposed to machine bezels on the later versions that I was doing. Now what I'm also going to do on this is I'm going to attempt to, after I spin it around a little bit more for you to see, is I'm going to open up the engine bay. Now one other thing I'd like to mention, which I neglected to say about the other two cars, all of these, this whole edition, these were also authorized, these were approved by Touring Superleggera. The bodies on these were designed by Carlo Felice Bianchi Anderloni of Touring Superleggera. And as mentioned, they approved this. In fact, my Barchetta models are the only models that were ever approved by Touring Superleggera. Now, to point out another little detail before we open up the hood on this puppy, the grills were chromed on this too, similar to as on the real car. It had little teeny details like where I'm pointing with a pencil. Those are actually little signal lights, little turn signal lights that are inset into the front of the bodywork. Again, so many differences on every single Barchetta. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to attempt to open up the hood on this, which I haven't done in years. Generally I keep it sealed. I like looking at the cars in their state with everything closed. Pretty much so similar to the way a lot of people do with their trailer queens and their car collections, that they restore, they show, they drive, but they don't, that they don't drive. And I'll get this undone in a moment. There we go. And the leather strap comes off. It's got to go out through the threaded, the buckles, harnesses. You'll notice also a difference again on this engine. 3 engines that were done. Details, there's a lot of differences on the plumbing, on the wiring. Each one of these cars was a triple carb setup, but you'll notice that on the Le Mans car it had the big airbox over all 3 carburetors. On the previous one of the yellow Barchetta showed the ram's horn style air cleaners, and this has the stand-up round air cleaners, and we've got little FISPA tags on top of them too. So again, just numerous differences and things you had to pay attention to. So these are pretty good. I mean, we really followed a lot of the detail that was different on all the cars. But again, I would go a lot further today if I was making these. I'd also probably do them in 1/12 scale versus 1/14. But 1/14 was the scale of the day, and that was what other companies were doing. And I wanted to show that we could do something made in America that was more accurate, better, more detailed, and more value than what anyone else was producing. And that's something I'd like to point out again too. These were made here in the States. The only things that were done overseas were the wire wheels, and those were handmade in Italy. And that is, I think that's pretty much for our little show and tell on the Barchettas today. Thanks for taking a look.